It all started with an innocent moment that quickly spiraled into something I could never have predicted. What would you do if the lines between trust, loyalty, and forbidden attraction blurred right before your eyes? This story will take you on an emotional journey of heartbreak, betrayal, and choices that can never be undone. Before we dive into this gripping tale, make sure to subscribe to my channel and share in the comments where you're watching from today. I'd love to hear from you. When the door clicked shut behind him, I knew I had to control my breathing. The room was still, the tension so thick it felt alive. My hands trembled as I reached for the glass on the coffee table, barely managing not to knock it over. He sat across from me, his eyes searching mine, looking for something. I wasn't sure what, but the intensity made my heart race. "I can fix it," he said, breaking the silence that had stretched too long. "Fix it." That's how it always started. A loose hinge here, a leaky faucet there. My husband always said his son was good with his hands. Too good, perhaps. And here we were, once again in the odd dynamic that had crept into our relationship when no one was paying attention. Except now things were different. The air felt different. "Sure," I replied, forcing a smile that barely masked my unease. "It's in the garage. Let me show you." I rose, smoothing my blouse as I led the way. I was hyper-aware of his presence behind me. He was taller than his father, broader too, though still boyish in some ways. I shouldn't have noticed things like that, but I did. My husband's absence left a void, one I had never thought I'd feel so acutely. I opened the garage door, the faint smell of motor oil and sawdust wafting out. The workbench was cluttered, just as my husband had left it months ago, but the toolbox was where it always was, neatly arranged because of him. "You've got a nice setup here," he said, stepping closer. I nodded, trying to focus on something, anything, other than the way he stood so casually, his hands brushing against the tools, his presence overwhelming the small space. "It's all your dad's," I replied, stepping back to give him room. "He's the handyman around here, I just manage the chaos." He laughed, a soft, easy sound that made my chest tighten. "I've noticed. You're good at managing things." There it was again, that tone. It was subtle, but it lingered. My cheeks flushed, and I busied myself with rearranging the random clutter on the bench. I didn't look up, afraid of what I might see in his expression. "What's wrong with it?" he asked, gesturing toward the item in question. "The mower?" I said, my voice slightly higher than I intended. "It keeps stalling. I don't know if it's the spark plug or something else." He nodded, squatting down to inspect the machine. His shirt stretched across his back, the fabric straining in a way that made me feel things I shouldn't. I turned away, fiddling with a broken screwdriver. "You don't have to hang around," he said, his voice cutting through my thoughts. "I'll handle it." "No, it's fine," I said quickly, too quickly. "I don't have much else to do." I stayed, leaning against the doorway as he worked. His movements were sure, confident, but there was an ease to him, a comfort in his skin that I envied. The minutes dragged, each one amplifying the strange energy between us. "You're staring," he said suddenly, without looking up. What?" I stammered, caught off guard. "You've been watching me the whole time," he said, finally turning to meet my eyes. There was a teasing lilt to his voice, but his gaze was steady, too steady. "I'm just making sure you're doing it right," I said, forcing a lightness I didn't feel. "Right," he said, smirking as he turned back to the mower. I should have left then. I should have walked out, found something else to do, but my feet stayed rooted to the spot. The garage was suddenly too warm, the air too thick, and I could feel the walls closing in. He glanced over his shoulder, catching me off guard again. "You know, you don't have to be nervous around me," he said, his voice softer now. "Nervous?" I laughed, though it sounded hollow even to me. "Why would I be nervous?" "I don't know," he said, standing up slowly. He wiped his hands on a rag, his eyes never leaving mine. "Maybe because you feel like this is different." "Different how?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He took a step closer, closing the gap between us just enough to make my pulse quicken. "I don't know," he said again, his tone thoughtful. "You tell me." The air between us crackled with something I couldn't name, something I didn't want to name. My hands clenched at my sides, my breath shallow. I needed to leave. I needed to say something, do something, anything to break the spell. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, frozen, as he reached past me to grab a wrench from the wall. His arm brushed mine, and the contact sent a jolt through me that I tried to ignore. He stepped back, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Something I recognized because I felt it too. "Thanks for letting me fix this," he said, his voice low. "It's nice to be helpful." He held my gaze for a moment longer before turning back to the mower. My chest felt tight, my mind racing as I finally found the strength to walk away. But even as I stepped into the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that we had crossed a line we couldn't uncross. Later that evening, I found myself replaying the events in the garage over and over again. I stood in the kitchen, staring blankly at the simmering pot on the stove, the rhythmic bubbling of the stew doing little to quiet my thoughts. My husband had called earlier, his voice crackling over the line as he told me he'd be delayed. Again. He'd been gone for 3 weeks this time, a grueling work schedule that was becoming more and more common. I tried not to let it bother me, but the loneliness had crept in like an uninvited guest. It wasn't that I didn't love him, I did, but love didn't keep you warm at night or fill the empty hours of the day when no one was around to talk to. That's when I noticed him. The stepson who had once been a quiet, withdrawn teenager, now a man who seemed to see through me in ways that made me uncomfortable. "Sells good," his voice broke through my thoughts. I jumped, almost dropping the spoon in my hand. "Oh, you scared me," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. He leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, an amused grin playing on his lips. "Sorry," he said, though he didn't look sorry at all. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you." I turned back to the stove, suddenly hyper-aware of his presence. "Dinner will be ready soon," I said, trying to sound casual. "Your dad probably won't be back until late, so it's just us." "Again?" he asked, his tone neutral, though I caught the slightest edge of something in his voice. "You'd think he'd want to be here more." "He's busy," I replied, more defensively than I intended. "It's his job." "Sure," he said, stepping further into the kitchen. "But you don't deserve to be alone so much." The comment caught me off guard, and I turned to look at him. There was something in his eyes. Concern, maybe, or understanding. It was unsettling how easily he seemed to read me. "I'm not alone," I said, forcing a smile. "You're here." He smiled back, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I guess I am." The rest of the evening passed in an awkward kind of normalcy. We ate dinner in the living room, a movie playing in the background as we made small talk about mundane things. His classes, my work, the neighbors' ongoing feud over their shared fence. But beneath the surface, there was a tension I couldn't ignore. His gaze lingered just a little too long, and my laugh came just a little too easily. It was like walking a tightrope, each step precariously balanced between what was appropriate and what wasn't. After the movie ended, I stood to collect the plates, but he stopped me. "I'll get it," he said, reaching for the dishes. "You don't have to." "I want to," he interrupted, his hand brushing mine as he took the plate. The touch was brief, but it sent a shiver up my spine. I watched him carry the dishes into the kitchen, his movements easy and confident. He was so different from the boy I'd met years ago when he'd first come to live with us after his mother's passing. Back then, he'd been shy and unsure of himself, struggling to find his place in a new family. But now, he seemed to own every space he entered, his presence impossible to ignore. I lingered in the doorway as he loaded the dishwasher, the sound of clinking plates filling the silence. He glanced up and caught me watching, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Something on your mind?" he asked. "No," I said quickly, stepping back. "Just tired." He closed the dishwasher and leaned against the counter, crossing his arms as he studied me. "You should take it easy," he said. "You do too much." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "That's what your dad says." "Maybe he's right," he replied, his voice softer now. "You deserve to be taken care of, too." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, I turned and headed upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. As I climbed the stairs, I could feel his eyes on me, the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. It wasn't until I closed the bedroom door behind me that I allowed myself to exhale. The next morning, I woke early, hoping to shake off the unease that had settled over me the night before. I spent the day cleaning the house, scrubbing floors and dusting shelves with an almost frantic energy. It was easier to keep busy than to dwell on thoughts I couldn't afford to have. By the time he came downstairs, the sun was high in the sky, streaming through the windows and casting a warm glow over the living room. He looked freshly showered, his hair damp and his shirt clinging to his frame. I hated how my eyes lingered, hated the way my pulse quickened at the sight of him. "Morning," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. He yawned as he made his way to the kitchen, his movements unhurried. "Good morning," I replied, keeping my tone light. "There's coffee in the pot." "Thanks," he said, pouring himself a cup. He took a sip and leaned against the counter, watching me as I folded laundry on the couch. "You've been busy." "Just trying to stay productive," I said, not looking up. "Your dad likes the house clean when he gets back." "Maybe he should be the one cleaning it," he said, a hint of bitterness in his voice. I glanced up at him, surprised by his tone. "He works hard," I said. "He provides for us." "Ah," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "But what about you? Who takes care of you?" The question caught me off guard, and I didn't know how to answer. He stepped closer, his gaze steady and unwavering. "You don't have to do everything alone," he said, his voice low. "You know that, right?" The sincerity in his voice made my chest ache, and I looked away, my hands trembling as I folded the last towel. "I'm fine," I said, though the words felt hollow. But even as I said them, I couldn't ignore the truth in his eyes, or the way they made me feel. It started with small things, the kind you wouldn't think twice about if you weren't already in a fragile state of mind. The way his eyes lingered when I walked into the room, or the subtle shift in his voice when we talked about anything more personal. It wasn't overt, no grand gestures or explicit remarks, just a slow erosion of the boundaries we were supposed to maintain. That afternoon, I was in the garden trimming the rose bushes, lost in thought, when I heard the back door creak open. I turned to see him standing on the patio, a bottle of water in one hand and a curious expression on his face. "Need a hand?" he asked. I hesitated, unsure if I wanted the company. "I think I've got it under control," I said, brushing stray leaves off my gloves. You sure? He stepped down onto the grass, closing the distance between us. I don't mind helping. Before I could respond, he knelt beside me, reaching for the pruning shears. His shoulder brushed mine and I stiffened, hyper-aware of how close he was. You're going to ruin your shirt, I said, more sharply than I intended. He laughed, low and easy as he set to work. It's just a shirt, he said. You've been out here all day, haven't you? Not all day, I replied, focusing intently on the bush in front of me. Just trying to stay busy. You do that a lot, he said, his tone thoughtful. Keep busy, like you're trying to avoid something. I froze, my hands stilling in the dirt. I don't know what you mean. You always have an excuse, he continued, his voice soft but insistent. Cleaning, cooking, gardening. It's like you're afraid to sit still. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood, brushing the dirt from my knees. You don't know what you're talking about. He stood too, towering over me as his gaze searched my face. Maybe not, he said quietly, but I notice things. The intensity in his eyes was too much, and I turned away, my heart pounding in my chest. I'm going inside, I said, my voice unsteady. Thanks for the help. I didn't wait for his response, retreating into the house and closing the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, but the image of his face, so open, so certain, was burned into my mind. That evening, we ended up in the living room again, another movie playing as we ate dinner on the couch. It felt easier this way, with something to focus on other than the growing tension between us. But even as the scenes unfolded on the screen, I couldn't stop stealing glances at him, each one drawing me deeper into the dangerous waters I was trying so hard to avoid. At one point, he reached over to grab the remote, his arm brushing against mine. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. He noticed, of course, his lips twitching in a knowing smile. You're jumpy tonight, he said, leaning back against the cushions. I'm not jumpy, I said quickly, too quickly. Just tired. Right, he said, his tone teasing but not unkind. Tired. I focused on the screen, determined to ignore him, but he shifted closer, his presence impossible to overlook. What are you doing? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Nothing, he said, his tone innocent. Just watching the movie. But his proximity made it clear that it wasn't just the movie he was paying attention to. I could feel the heat radiating off him, his scent clean and warm, filling the space between us. My pulse quickened, and I forced myself to stay still, afraid that moving would betray just how affected I was. I think I'm going to call it a night, I said abruptly, standing and gathering my plate. Already? He asked, his gaze following me as I moved toward the kitchen. It's early. I'm tired, I said, keeping my back to him. Long day. I felt his eyes on me as I rinsed my plate in the sink, the weight of his gaze making my skin prickle. When I finally turned around, he was standing in the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. Good night, then, he said, his voice soft but laced with something I couldn't quite place. Good night, I replied, my voice unsteady. The next day, I resolved to put some distance between us. I busied myself with errands, running to the store and visiting a friend in an effort to avoid being alone in the house with him. But by the time I returned, the sun was setting, and I knew I couldn't avoid him forever. He was in the kitchen when I walked in, his back to me as he cooked something on the stove. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the air, and for a moment I stood there, watching him. He looked so at ease, so at home. and it stirred something in me that I didn't want to acknowledge. "Hey," he said, turning to face me, "I made dinner." "You didn't have to do that," I said, setting my bags on the counter. "I wanted to," he said, his gaze steady. "You've been running yourself ragged lately. Let me take care of you for a change." The words sent a pang through me, and I looked away, busying myself with unpacking the groceries. "I'm fine," I said, my voice too bright. "Really?" "Sure," he said, leaning against the counter as he watched me. "You keep saying that, but I don't think you believe it." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I said nothing, focusing instead on organizing the pantry. But even as I worked, I could feel his presence behind me, solid and unyielding. "You don't have to do everything alone," he said softly, and the vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard. I turned to face him, my hands trembling at my sides. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I think you do." The words hung between us, heavy and charged, and for a moment I thought I might drown in the silence. But then he stepped back, giving me space, and the moment passed, leaving me shaken and unsure of what was to come. The week seemed to crawl by in slow motion, each day filled with a suffocating tension I couldn't escape. I tried to put more distance between us, but it felt like every effort only brought us closer. The house felt smaller, the walls pressing in on me, and every glance, every word he spoke carried an undercurrent of something I couldn't ignore. It all came to a head on Friday evening. I was folding laundry in the living room when he came down the stairs. His hair was damp and he was wearing a plain gray t-shirt that clung to his frame, hinting at the strength he carried so casually. I didn't look up, keeping my focus on the towels in front of me, but I could feel his eyes on me, could feel the weight of his presence as he walked closer. "What are you up to tonight?" he asked, his voice light but laced with curiosity. "Just finishing this and then heading to bed," I said, not looking at him. "No plans to relax?" he teased. "You're always working." "I don't have much else to do," I replied, folding the last towel and setting it on the stack. "You could watch a movie with me," he offered. His tone was casual, but there was something beneath it, something that made me hesitate. "I think I'm going to turn in early," I said, standing and grabbing the laundry basket. "It's been a long day." He stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "You can take a break, you know," he said softly. "You don't always have to keep yourself busy." I looked up at him then, my heart racing as our eyes met. There it was again. That look. The one that made me feel exposed, as if he could see straight through me. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say anything, the front door opened. The sound was like a gunshot, jolting us both out of the moment. I turned quickly, my heart leaping into my throat as my husband walked in, his briefcase in one hand and a tired smile on his face. "Hey, honey," he said, oblivious to the tension in the room. "I'm home." "You're early," I said, my voice higher than usual. "I thought you weren't coming back until tomorrow." "Managed to wrap things up early," he said, setting his briefcase down and shrugging off his coat. "Thought I'd surprise you." He walked over and kissed my cheek, his hands lingering on my shoulders. I forced a smile, my heart pounding as I glanced over his shoulder at my stepson. He stood frozen in place, his expression carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched at his sides. "Good to see you, Dad," he said, his voice steady but lacking the usual warmth. "You too, kid," my husband said, turning to clap him on the back. "What have you two been up to?" "Not much," I said quickly. "Just chores." "Well, "It's good to be home," he said, sinking onto the couch. "I'm exhausted." "I'll get dinner started," I said, grabbing the laundry basket and heading toward the kitchen. I needed to get out of the room, needed to put some space between me and the suffocating weight of what had just happened. The evening passed uneventfully, but the tension lingered. My husband didn't seem to notice, too preoccupied with recounting his trip and catching up on emails, but I could feel it every time my stepson and I crossed paths, the unspoken weight of what could have been, what almost was, hanging between us like a storm cloud. Later, as I cleaned up after dinner, my husband announced he was heading to bed early. "Long week," he said, kissing my forehead. "I'll see you in the morning." "Good night," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I watched him disappear up the stairs, my chest tight with guilt and relief. I finished tidying the kitchen and was about to head to my room when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see my stepson standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm fine," I said quickly, "just tired." "You always say that," he said, his gaze piercing. "But I don't think it's true." "Please?" I said, my voice trembling. "Not tonight." He stepped closer, his expression softening. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you." "You didn't," I said, though we both knew it was a lie. "It's just complicated." He nodded, his eyes filled with an understanding that made my chest ache. "I'll give you space," he said, "if that's what you want." I didn't respond, couldn't find the words. Instead, I turned and walked away, my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, I woke to the sound of voices downstairs. I got dressed quickly, my stomach twisting with nerves as I headed toward the kitchen. My husband and stepson were sitting at the table, their conversation easy and light. But as soon as I walked in, the atmosphere shifted. "Morning, honey," my husband said, smiling up at me. "Sleep well?" "Fine," I said, forcing a smile as I poured myself a cup of coffee. My stepson avoided my gaze, focusing intently on his plate. "Fine. I was just telling him about the new project," my husband said, oblivious to the tension. "We've got some big things in the works." "That's great," I said, my voice hollow. The rest of the day passed in a blur. My husband seemed blissfully unaware, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my stepson was watching me, his eyes following me as I moved around the house. By the time evening rolled around, I was on edge, my nerves frayed. I was folding laundry in the bedroom when my husband walked in, his expression serious. "We need to talk," he said. "What is it?" I asked, my heart sinking. "It's about him," he said, his voice low. "I don't know what's going on, but something feels off." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he said, running a hand through his hair. "But I've noticed the way he looks at you, and the way you avoid him." Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You're imagining things," I said, my voice steady. "There's nothing going on." He studied me for a long moment before nodding. "Maybe you're right," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. As he left the room, I sank onto the bed, my hands trembling. The walls were closing in, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep the truth hidden. By the time Sunday rolled around, I was a bundle of nerves. My husband, thankfully, was planning to spend most of the day catching up on work in his office, leaving me to try and salvage what little normalcy I could muster. But that illusion of normalcy was shattered when I found myself alone in the kitchen with my stepson again. I was washing dishes when he walked in, his movements deliberate and unhurried. I didn't look at him, keeping my focus on the soapy water, but I could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on me. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. "No, I'm fine," I said, my tone clipped. "You always say that," he said, stepping closer, "but you don't seem fine." I turned to face him, my hands still dripping with soap. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He hesitated, his gaze searching mine. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I can't stop thinking about us." "There is no us," I said quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. "You need to stop." "Stop what?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "Stop feeling this? Stop seeing the way you look at me when you think no one's watching?" "Keep your voice down," I hissed, glancing toward the hallway. "Your father is right upstairs." "Exactly," he said, stepping closer. "He's upstairs. He's always somewhere else, always too busy to see what's happening right in front of him." His words stung, not because they were untrue, but because they hit too close to a truth I didn't want to face. I stepped back, putting more distance between us. "This isn't right," I said, my voice trembling. "Whatever you think is happening, it needs to stop." "You don't mean that," he said, his tone softer now. "I can see it in your eye." I shook my head, refusing to let him draw me in. "You're imagining things," I said, turning back to the sink. "Go back to your room." He didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer, so close that I could feel the heat of him at my back. "I'm not imagining anything," he said, his voice low and insistent. "I know you feel it too." "Stop," I said, my voice breaking. But he didn't stop. He reached out, his hand brushing against my arm, and the contact sent a shiver through me that I couldn't ignore. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as he leaned in, his lips close to my ear. "Tell me you don't feel it," he whispered. "Tell me, and I'll leave you alone." I couldn't. The words were there on the tip of my tongue, but they wouldn't come. Instead, I turned to face him, my heart racing as I looked into his eyes. The room seemed to tilt, the world narrowing until there was nothing but the two of us. And then it happened. He leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft and tentative, as if he was giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands gripping the edge of the counter as the kiss deepened. It was electric, a rush of heat and longing that I hadn't felt in years. For a moment, I forgot everything. Forgot about my husband upstairs, forgot about the line we were crossing, forgot about the consequences that would inevitably follow. All I could think about was him. The way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in so long. But the moment shattered as quickly as it began. "What the hell is going on here?" The voice was like a thunderclap, freezing us both in place. I turned, my stomach dropping as I saw my husband standing in the doorway, his face a mask of shock and fury. "It's not what it looks like," I said, the words tumbling out of me before I could think. "Not what it looks like?" he repeated, his voice rising. "I just saw you kissing my son. What the hell do you call that?" I looked at my stepson, his face pale but defiant, and then back at my husband. "I can explain," I said, though I knew there was no explanation that could make this right. "Save it," he said, his voice cold. He turned to his son, his jaw tight. "Get out." "What?" my stepson said, his voice cracking. "You're kicking me out?" "I don't want to see your face right now," my husband said. "Pack your things and go." "No," I said quickly, stepping forward. "This is my fault. Don't blame him." My husband turned to me, his eyes blazing. You think this is all on you? It takes two, doesn't it? Or were you just some helpless victim in all of this? I started, but the words failed me. I looked at my stepson, who was staring at his father with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. I'm not going anywhere, my stepson said finally, his voice steady. This is my home too. Not anymore, my husband said. You've made your choice, and now you can live with the consequences. Stop it, I shouted, my voice breaking. You're making this worse. Worse, my husband said, laughing bitterly. How could it possibly be worse than what I just walked in on? The three of us stood there, the silence between us heavy and suffocating. Finally, my stepson turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps heavy on the stairs as he headed to his room. The hours that followed were a blur of tears and shouting, accusations flying back and forth like daggers. My husband demanded answers, demanded to know how long it had been going on, and each question felt like a blow. It wasn't planned, I said, my voice trembling. It just happened. Just happened, he repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. Do you even hear yourself? I couldn't meet his eyes, couldn't face the anger and betrayal that burned there. I'm sorry, I whispered, though I knew it wasn't enough. Sorry, he said, laughing bitterly. You're sorry? Do you have any idea what you've done to this family? I didn't respond. There was nothing I could say to make it better, nothing that could undo the damage we had done. Eventually, he left the room, slamming the door behind him. I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands, as the weight of what had just happened crashed down on me. That night, the house was eerily silent. My husband locked himself in the guest room, and my stepson stayed in his room, the tension between us all palpable. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep as the events of the day replayed in my mind. I had crossed a line I could never uncross, and now I was left to pick up the pieces of a life I had shattered with my own hands. In the quiet darkness, I wondered if there was any way to fix what I had broken, or if it was already too late. The days that followed felt like walking through a minefield. The once familiar rhythm of our home was shattered, replaced by a strained silence that hung heavy in the air. My husband barely spoke to me, his cold indifference cutting deeper than any argument ever could. He moved like a ghost through the house, avoiding me as much as possible, and I didn't blame him. I didn't know how to face him either. My stepson, on the other hand, was defiant. He didn't apologize or shrink away from the tension. He stayed, holding his ground as if daring anyone to confront him. His confidence unnerved me, made it impossible to brush aside what had happened. Each time we crossed paths, the weight of his gaze reminded me of the line we had crossed, the secret we now shared. The secret we now shared. It wasn't long before the neighbors began to notice. My husband's car was parked at odd hours, and the lack of our usual smiles and waves became glaringly obvious. Mrs. Donahue from next door stopped me one morning while I was watering the flowers, her concern barely veiled behind her polite smile. Is everything all right, dear? She asked, her eyes sharp with curiosity. Yes, of course, I lied, forcing a smile. Just busy, you know how it is. She nodded, but her expression told me she didn't believe me. The weight of her scrutiny lingered long after she walked away, adding another layer of tension to an already unbearable situation. The confrontation I had been dreading came one evening when my husband finally broke his silence. He found me in the living room, staring blankly at the television, the volume low enough to hear the muffled sounds of his footsteps approaching. We need to talk, he said, his voice low but firm. I turned to face him, my stomach knotting with dread. Okay, He stood in the doorway for a moment, his arms crossed over his chest, before stepping inside. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly, "but we can't go on like this." "I know," I said quietly. "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix this," he said, his tone sharp. "I trusted you. I trusted both of you." "I never meant for this to happen," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake." He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "A mistake? That's what you call it?" I didn't respond. What could I say? Every word felt hollow, every excuse meaningless in the face of what I had done. "You've torn this family apart," he said, his voice breaking. "Do you even understand that? Do you care?" "I do," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I care more than you know." He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tight, before turning and walking away. I sank back onto the couch, my chest heaving with silent sobs. The distance between us felt insurmountable, and I didn't know if we could ever find our way back. Meanwhile, the tension between my husband and his son continued to escalate. They avoided each other as much as possible, but when they did cross paths, their interactions were clipped and filled with barely concealed hostility. The strain was palpable, and I felt caught in the middle, unable to mediate or soothe the wounds we had all inflicted on one another. One evening, I overheard them arguing in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but the intensity of their words carried through the walls. "You don't get to act like the victim," my husband hissed. "You knew exactly what you were doing." "And so did she," my stepson shot back, his tone defiant. "But you don't see her paying for it, do you?" "You're my son," my husband said, his voice trembling with anger. "You were supposed to respect me, respect this family." "And what about her?" my stepson countered. "Why does she get a free pass?" "She doesn't," my husband said, "but you're still under my roof and you'll follow my rules." "For now," my stepson said, his voice cold, "but don't think I'll forget how you're handling this." Their voices dropped after that, the rest of their conversation too muffled to make out. I stayed frozen in my spot, my heart racing as their words echoed in my mind. The rift between them was growing wider by the day, and I didn't know how to stop it. The breaking point came a few days later. It was late, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. I was in the kitchen, nursing a glass of wine and trying to unwind after another tense day, when my stepson walked in. His presence startled me, but I didn't move. Didn't say anything as he grabbed a glass of water and leaned against the counter. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Do I look okay?" He didn't respond, just watched me with those piercing eyes that always seemed to see too much. The silence stretched between us, heavy and oppressive, until he finally spoke. "I don't regret it," he said, his voice steady. I turned to face him, my chest tightening. "You should." "Why?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. "Because it's wrong? Because it hurt him?" "Yes," I said, my voice trembling. "Because it's tearing this family apart." "Maybe it needed to be torn apart," he said, his tone unapologetic. "Maybe it wasn't as perfect as everyone pretended it was." "You don't mean that," I said, my heart aching at the bitterness in his voice. "Don't I?" he asked, stepping closer. "You're not happy. You haven't been for a long time. I see it, even if he doesn't." "That doesn't make this right," I said, my voice breaking. "It doesn't excuse what we did." "Maybe not," he said, his tone softening. "But it doesn't change how I feel." I closed my eyes, willing the tears to stop, but they fell anyway. You need to stop, I said. We both do. I don't think I can, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Not when I know you feel it too. The sound of footsteps upstairs brought us back to reality, and he stepped back, his expression guarded. I wiped my eyes quickly, my heart racing as the tension between us crackled like a live wire. Good night, he said, his voice soft. Good night, I whispered, watching him disappear into the darkness of the hallway. As I stood there, the weight of our choices pressing down on me, I realized that we were hurtling toward a breaking point, one that would change everything. And there was no going back. The house felt heavier than ever, the kind of oppressive silence that wraps around your throat and makes it hard to breathe. My husband had spent the last few days in an almost calculated avoidance, moving from room to room with a detached air that left me questioning what was brewing beneath the surface. I knew something was coming, something I couldn't stop or prepare for, but I clung to the fragile hope that we could somehow find a way through this mess. It wasn't long before that hope was shattered. It was Sunday evening, and we were all in the living room. My husband was seated in his armchair, flipping aimlessly through channels on the television, his jaw set and his posture rigid. My stepson sat on the couch, his phone in hand, but his attention flicked between the screen and his father with barely concealed tension. I pretended to read a book, though my eyes hadn't moved past the same paragraph in 20 minutes. Finally, my husband turned off the television and set the remote down with deliberate precision. The sound echoed in the quiet room, and my stomach tightened as I looked up. His gaze was locked on my stepson, his expression a mixture of anger and disappointment. We need to talk, he said, his voice calm but laced with steel. Here we go, my stepson muttered, leaning back against the couch. What now? Don't, my husband said sharply. Don't act like this is nothing. You think I haven't noticed the way you've been acting? The way you look at her? My stepson's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. And you, my husband said, turning his glare on me. I thought I could trust you. I thought you were better than this. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of his accusation was too much, the truth too damning. What do you want me to say? I asked finally, my voice trembling. That I'm sorry? That it was a mistake? Because I've already said that. A mistake, he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. A mistake doesn't happen more than once. A mistake doesn't involve feelings. My stepson sat forward then, his eyes blazing with defiance. Maybe if you were around more, things wouldn't have gotten this far. The words hung in the air like a gunshot, and my husband's face twisted with rage. Don't you dare try to blame this on me, he said, his voice rising. You knew exactly what you were doing. So did she, my stepson shot back. But you're putting all of this on me, like I'm the only one who crossed a line. That's enough, I said, my voice shaking as I stood. Both of you, this isn't helping. My husband turned to me, his expression a mixture of fury and heartbreak. You don't get to play the peacemaker now, he said. You're the one who caused this. I know, I said, tears streaming down my face. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But standing here and tearing each other apart isn't going to fix anything. Pixe, he repeated, laughing bitterly. There's no fixing this. How do you come back from something like this? I don't know, I said, my voice breaking. But I know that fighting like this will only make it worse. The silence that followed was deafening. My stepson stared at the floor, his jaw tight, while my husband ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders slumping with the weight of it all. You need to leave, my husband said finally, his voice low. What? I asked, my stomach dropping. You need to go, he repeated, looking at me now. I can't have you here, not after this. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Where am I supposed to go? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. That's not my problem, he said coldly. I need time to think, time to figure out if I can ever look at you the same way again. My stepson stood then, his expression hard. If she goes, I go. I said, no one's asking you to stay, my husband said, his voice sharp. In fact, I'd prefer it if you left. The tension in the room was suffocating, and for a moment no one moved. Then my stepson turned to me, his gaze softening. Let's go, he said, his voice steady. I looked between them, my heart breaking at the sight of what had once been a family now in ruins. I can't leave, I said finally. Not like this. You already have, my husband said, his voice cracking. You left the moment you decided that whatever this is, he gestured between me and his son, was worth more than us. His words hit like a blow, and I stumbled back, tears streaming down my face. I didn't mean to hurt you, I said, my voice trembling. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. But it did, he said, his voice cold. And now we all have to live with it. That night, I packed a bag and left. My stepson followed, though I begged him to stay. This is your home, I said, my voice breaking. You shouldn't have to leave because of me. I'm not staying here, he said firmly, not without you. Hi. We left the house in silence, the weight of what we had done pressing down on us like a physical thing. As we drove away, I looked back at the house one last time, the life I had destroyed disappearing into the distance. Disappearing into the distance. I didn't know where we were going or what would happen next. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. The motel room was small and cold, its sterile walls and thin, scratchy sheets doing little to offer comfort. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the floral potato curtains that barely masked the neon glow of the sign outside. My stepson sat in the armchair by the window, scrolling aimlessly through his phone, the silence between us heavy with everything left unsaid. I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd left behind. The house, my husband, the life I had built over years of love and compromise. It was all gone now, shattered into pieces that I didn't know how to put back together. The weight of it pressed on my chest, making it hard to breathe. You don't have to stay here, I said finally, breaking the silence. My voice was hoarse, thick with the tears I had been holding back all night. You have your whole life ahead of you. You should go back. And leave you here? He asked, looking up from his phone. His tone was steady, but there was an edge of disbelief in his voice. I'm not doing that. This isn't your mess to fix, I said, my hands trembling as I twisted them in my lap. I made the choices that led us here, not you. It's my mess too, he said firmly, setting his phone down. We're in this together, whether you like it or not. I looked at him then, the determination in his eyes, the way he sat so still and composed, even as the world around us crumbled. There was a part of me that wanted to let him take the burden, to lean on him the way I had over the past few weeks. But I couldn't. I wouldn't drag him down with me any more than I already had. You have to let me go, I said, my voice breaking. You need to go back and fix things with your dad. You still have a chance to make things right. He shook his head, his jaw tightening. You think he'll ever forgive me? After what happened? He's your father, I said softly. He loves you. Maybe, he said, his voice bitter, but he'll never look at me the same way again. His words hit me harder than I expected. and I felt fresh tears spill down my cheeks. I hated what I had done to him, to his family, to all of us. The choices I had made had ruined more than my marriage. They had destroyed the bond between father and son, a bond that should have been unbreakable. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I'm so, so sorry." "I don't need your apology," he said, his tone softening. "I just need you to stop blaming yourself for everything." "How can I not?" I asked, the tears falling freely now. "I've ruined everything." "You didn't ruin me," he said quietly. "You made me feel like I mattered, like someone cared." His words broke something in me, and I covered my face with my hands, sobbing into the stillness of the room. I felt him sit down beside me, his arm wrapping around my shoulders as he pulled me close. His warmth, his steady presence, was a comfort I didn't deserve, but I couldn't bring myself to pull away. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice muffled by my hands. "We figure it out," he said simply. "One step at a time." The next few days passed in a blur. We moved to a new motel on the other side of town, trying to keep a low profile while we figured out our next move. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from my husband, alternating between anger, confusion, and desperation. I couldn't bring myself to answer any of them. What could I say? How could I possibly explain the unexplainable? My stepson was a constant presence, his quiet determination a stark contrast to the chaos swirling around us. He insisted on paying for the motel room with his savings, refusing to let me shoulder the financial burden. "You've done enough for me," he said when I protested. "Let me do this for you." I didn't have the strength to argue. One afternoon, I finally mustered the courage to call my husband. My hands trembled as I dialed his number, the sound of his voice on the other end of the line both familiar and foreign. "I just need to know if you're okay," he said, his tone weary. "That's all." "I'm fine," I said, though the words felt like a lie. "I'm sorry I didn't call sooner." "Where are you?" he asked. "I just want to talk, face to face." "I can't," I said quickly, my heart racing. "Not yet." "Not yet," he repeated, his voice heavy with resignation. "Do you even want to come back?" "I don't know," I admitted, tears welling in my eyes. "I don't know if I can." My father made a human. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear him exhale slowly. "I don't know if I can either," he said finally, his voice breaking. "But I miss you. I miss us." "I miss you too," I said, my voice trembling. "But I don't know how to fix this." "Maybe we can't," he said, his tone resigned. "But I think we owe it to ourselves to try." The call ended with no resolution, just the lingering weight of words left unsaid. I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone in my hand, wondering if there was a way back to the life I had left behind, or if it was already too late. That evening, as I sat on the motel bed staring out the window, my stepson sat down beside me. "You talked to him, didn't you?" he asked. I nodded, my throat tight. "He wants me to come back." "Are you going to?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know if he'll ever forgive me, or if I'll ever forgive myself." "You don't have to make a decision right now," he said, his hand brushing against mine. "Just take it one day at a time." I turned to look at him, the sincerity in his eyes both comforting and heartbreaking. "I don't deserve you," I said quietly. "You don't get to decide that," he said, his lips curving into a small, sad smile. "I do." For the first time in days, I let myself smile back. A week passed in the quiet solitude of the motel room. Each day blurred into the next, filled with moments of reflection and uneasy silence. My stepson and I settled into a routine, but the weight of what had happened hung over us like a storm cloud. Every glance, every word we exchanged carried the unspoken truth of what we'd done and the chaos we'd left behind. Then came the moment I couldn't avoid any longer. It was a Friday evening when my phone buzzed with a message from my husband. "We need to talk. I'll be at the cafe on Main Street at 6 p.m. Please come." I stared at the screen for a long time, the words swimming before my eyes. I knew this wasn't just a casual conversation. This was a crossroads, a chance to face everything I had been running from. My heart pounded as I read the message again and again. "You're going, aren't you?" my stepson asked, his voice soft. I turned to look at him, my chest tightening at the way his eyes searched mine. He already knew the answer, but he needed to hear it from me. "I have to," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't leave things like this." He nodded, his jaw tight. "Do you want me to come with you?" "No," I said quickly, shaking my head. "This is something I have to do alone." The hours leading up to the meeting passed in a haze. I paced the room, rehearsing what I would say, but no words felt adequate. How do you apologize for tearing apart someone's life? How do you explain feelings that shouldn't exist? By the time I left, my hands were trembling, and my heart felt like it was about to burst from my chest. The cafe was quiet when I arrived, the warm glow of its lights spilling onto the sidewalk. I spotted him immediately, seated at a corner table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup. He looked up as I walked in, his expression unreadable. I hesitated for a moment, then forced my legs to move. When I reached the table, he gestured for me to sit. I slid into the chair across from him, the weight of his gaze making it hard to breathe. "Thank you for coming," he said finally, his voice low. "I didn't know if I should," I admitted, "but I couldn't keep avoiding you." He nodded, his eyes flicking down to the cup in his hands. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about us, about him." "To have I said softly, "and I hate what I've done to you, to all of us." He looked up then, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and something I couldn't quite place. "Do you love him?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could I answer that? How could I even begin to untangle the complicated mess of emotions that had led us here? "I don't know," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I don't know what I feel anymore." He nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. "I thought I'd be angrier," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But mostly I just feel tired. Tired of wondering what I did wrong. Tired of trying to figure out how to fix this." "You didn't do anything wrong," I said quickly. "This is on me. All of it." "Is it?" he asked, his gaze piercing. "You weren't the only one who felt something missing. I saw it too, even if I didn't want to admit it." His words cut deep, and I felt fresh tears sting my eyes. "I didn't want this to happen," I said, my voice trembling. "I never wanted to hurt you." "I know," he said, "but that doesn't change the fact that you did." We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of everything we'd been through pressing down on us. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his expression weary. "I think we need time apart," he said, "real time apart, for both of us to figure out what we want." I nodded, my heart breaking even as I understood his words. "I think you're right. I don't know if we can come back from this," he said, his voice soft, "but I think we owe it to ourselves to try." "I want to try," I said, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my face. I'll do whatever it takes. He nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. We'll see. When I returned to the motel, my stepson was waiting for me. He stood as I walked in, his expression unreadable. How did it go? He asked. He wants time apart, I said, setting my bag down and sinking onto the edge of the bed. To figure things out. That's good, he said after a moment. You both need that. I looked up at him, my chest tightening at the quiet determination in his eyes. And what about you? I asked. Where do we go from here? He hesitated, his hands clenching at his sides. I don't know, he admitted, but I know I don't regret what happened, not for a second. Tears filled my eyes as I looked at him, the weight of his words settling over me. I don't regret it either, I said softly. But we can't keep living like this. It's not fair. To you, to him, to anyone. What are you saying? He asked, his voice trembling. I'm saying we need to let this go, I said, my heart breaking with every word. We need to move on. He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tight and his eyes glistening. If that's what you want. It's what we need, I said, though the words felt like a lie even as I spoke them. The next morning, he packed his things and left. I watched from the window as he climbed into his car and drove away, the tears streaming down my face as I whispered a silent goodbye. The room felt impossibly empty without him, but I knew it was for the best. I stayed in the motel for a few more weeks, trying to piece my life back together one fragile moment at a time. My husband and I spoke occasionally, tentative conversations that felt more like walking through a minefield than rebuilding a relationship. But it was a start. As for my stepson, I didn't hear from him again. Not for a long time, but sometimes, late at night, I found myself thinking of him, of his smile, his laugh, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. And though I knew we'd made the right choice, the ache of what we'd lost never truly went away. In the end, life went on. But it would never be the same. This story captures the emotional complexity and devastating consequences of crossing boundaries within a family. It explores themes of loneliness, forbidden attraction, and the fragility of trust, unraveling how seemingly small moments can spiral into life-altering decisions. The narrator's inner turmoil and her stepson's defiant affection highlight the raw vulnerability of human emotions, while the husband's pain reflects the collateral damage of betrayal. The resolution underscores the impossibility of holding on to something that was never meant to be, as both the narrator and her stepson are forced to confront the repercussions of their actions. Ultimately, this is a story of loss and fractured relationships, where no one escapes unscathed, and moving on requires sacrifices that leave a lasting ache. It serves as a poignant reminder of the weight of choices and the irreparable damage they can leave behind.